Tim, most of us know who Herod the Great is. We know that he was a ruthless leader, a powerful leader. He was a master builder. He murdered several people in his own family. He is the man behind the slaughter of the innocents. So what do we need to know about him to understand him better?
Well, as is often the case, you got to back up a minute or two before he was born, get a little bit of a running start. So in one of our previous episodes, we talked about how the different empires maneuvered through the Middle East, and how as the Seleucid Empire was declining, the kingdom of Judea became independent. And that introduced a royal house known as the Hasmoneans, who ruled Judea, the independent kingdom of Judea, from the middle of the 2nd century until the middle of the 1st century, when they were eventually overcome by the Romans. Now, in 76 BC, the king, Alexander Jannaeus, he died. Interestingly enough, when he died, his wife became queen. This was the one and only time that Israel ever had a queen, because his eldest son wasn't young enough to be king just yet. So they appointed him high priest, because his wife couldn't be high priest because she wasn't male. So his eldest son, Hyrcanus, becomes high priest, and his mother is queen. Now, she rules for the next, 8-10 years, something like that, and then she dies, and Hyrcanus, the eldest son, he becomes king. But he's got a little brother, and his younger brother, his name is Aristobulus. And Aristobulus, in many ways, was better qualified to be king, not because of the right of primogeniture or anything like that. He just kind of had the better personality. He was going to be a more forthright ruler and things like that. So, and plus he was just ambitious. So Hyrcanus hadn't been king for very long when Aristobulus rebelled against him and threw it off, and he became king instead. Now this is interesting because Hyrcanus had a court official named Antipater, and Antipater stepped in and really helped Hyrcanus because, number one, he arranged for him to get refuge with the people known as the Nabateans. Today, what we would simply call the Arabians. It's the same area of the Middle East. So he took refuge among the Nabateans, and he also arranged for Hyrcanus to have a Nabatean army to back him up. So for the next several
Antipater did all of this.
Antipater did this. And then Antipater is what's known as an Idumean. Biblically, he came from the area known as Edom. So he's doing all of this for Hyrcanus, frankly, for political motivation. So Hyrcanus takes refuge among the Nabateans, and then Antipater arranges for an army, and Hyrcanus and Aristobulus engage in a civil war for about the next 4 or 5 years at this point.
This civil war between brothers lasts 3 years or so?
4 or 5.
Okay, all right. A handful of years, and what is the result of that?
Good question. See, because by this time, the Seleucid Empire is gone, and Rome is in the picture. So Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, they're at war, and Pompey Magnus, the Roman general Pompey, he becomes the ruler of that part of the Roman Empire. So they both appeal to Pompey to make them king. As a matter of fact, they both send bribes to Pompey for him to make them king. So Pompey looks at the situation, and he decides that Hyrcanus is actually the better ruler to represent Roman interests. So he puts Hyrcanus on the throne. Aristobulus doesn't like that very much, so he attempts a rebellion. That doesn't work very well for the Romans, so he eventually is defeated, and Pompey sends him prisoner to Rome.
If Hyrcanus is back on the throne, we still have Antipater, and what is he doing behind the scenes at this point?
Well, this is so much fun because Antipater, in many ways, is the power behind the throne.
Right.
So Hyrcanus may have indeed been the high priest and the king, but Antipater was really the power behind the throne. The way I like to phrase it is, when you look up the definition of ambition in the dictionary, it's Antipater's picture that is sitting there, because that's what he was all about. An extremely ambitious man. He knew that he probably would never sit on the throne, but he figured he might be able to get one of his 2 sons on the throne of Judea. So that is what he was maneuvering for.
So he's this very clever, ambitious maybe even opportunist man who's pulling the strings behind Hyrcanus. And what happens next?
Well, he's trying to serve Roman interests, and
Right.
legitimately, but he's really primarily serving his own interests.
Which are?
Well, the classic ones: wealth, power, influence, all those things.
Classic indeed.
Classic indeed, and frankly, control. And like I said before, he really wants to see if he can't get one of his own kids.
He's playing a long game.
Absolutely, get one of his kids to be on the throne.
The very shrewd Antipater, give me an example of what he would have done or what his interests were.
Absolutely. So in our timeline, one of the things that comes next on the big scale is the Roman Civil War. Pompey and Julius Caesar go to war. Julius Caesar is victorious. As a result, Pompey flees to Egypt. Now, interestingly enough, there's a civil war going on in Egypt at that exact same time between a brother and sister, Ptolemy and Cleopatra. Now, that's the Cleopatra we all know. When Pompey arrives in Egypt, one of Ptolemy's officers murders him.
Right off the bat?
Right off the bat. Now, this drives Julius Caesar into a rage because even though they were antagonists, this was his old friend and this was a Roman citizen. So as a result, he sided with Cleopatra in the war against her brother, but then in a very ironic twist, they begin to lose the war. So Caesar is all of a sudden on the losing end. But that's where our story gets really interesting, because guess who comes to the rescue?
Would that be Antipater?
That would be Antipater.
Wow.
He comes at the head of a combined Judean, Idumean, and Nabatean army. He comes to Julius Caesar's rescue in Egypt, and as a result, Julius Caesar rewards him by making him a Roman citizen. He appoints him the ruler of Judea, under Hyrcanus, and here we go. He makes Antipater's two sons the governors of Judea and Galilee. His son Faisal is the governor of Judea, and his son Herod becomes the governor of Galilee.
Young Herod has now entered the picture. He's a governor, a position that he wanted. His father wanted for him as well. What happens?
Well, Herod is really an amazing character, really has an amazing life story. Cruel man, but an amazing story. When he becomes governor of Galilee, he's only in his late 20s, but he's the perfect candidate. By the time he was in his late 20s, he's already an accomplished military leader. He apparently was quite the athlete and a skilled hunter and things like that. Military leader, brave, ruthless, the kind of things you wanted in a leader back then. But to top it all off, we are told that all of this paled in comparison to his skill as a politician.
Interesting. So he was charismatic and knew how to handle himself.
Absolutely.
Well, then what happens next? Because he's got a brother as well.
Sure. Well, his brother Faisal is governor of Judea. Herod is governor of Galilee. But then the whole scene kind of shifts pretty quickly.
How's that?
Well, Julius Caesar gets assassinated, who had appointed them, right? Antipater, their father, he gets assassinated. And as a result, the Roman general Mark Antony is now the new leader for the Romans in the eastern part of the empire. So they've got to change allegiances real quick. Now, Antony had been a friend of Caesar, so that wasn't incredibly difficult, but you got to play your cards right when you're playing this political game.
Of course.
Antony reconfirms them both in their positions as governors of Judea and Galilee.
Which is what they wanted. And so, again, where do we go from here?
Well, remember Aristobulus?
Yes.
Well, he's the guy.
He's the exiled brother.
He's the exiled brother that Pompey
Hyrcanus.
of Hyrcanus that Pompey sent to Rome as a prisoner. Well, his son, Antigonus, he escapes. And he escapes and comes back to Judea and starts instigating against Faisal and Herod and Hyrcanus, because he's taking up his father's cause
Sure.
and see if he can't stir up some trouble. So then, by about 40 BC, he really stirs up trouble. He goes to the Parthians.
The emerging superpower.
That's right, the emerging superpower on the eastern side of Judea. You got Rome on the west, you got Parthia on the east. So he goes to the Parthians, who they're not unlike the Romans. The Romans chose Hyrcanus to be on the throne because he would best represent Roman interests. The Parthians want Aristobulus or Antigonus because they believe that they will best represent Parthian interests. So Parthia invades Judea on behalf of Antigonus.
Parthia was a superpower, though.
That's right, they were. This was no small matter. This was a full-scale invasion.
Well, that sounds like, I mean, we would have to predict that Parthia would be very strong, and Antigonus, he's getting what he wants, I would think.
Well, absolutely. But it raises a really interesting scenario because up until then, the Romans hadn't garrisoned a lot of legions in Judea just yet. Sure, they had some troops there, but it wasn't a real lot. The Parthians came in full force. So now Hyrcanus, Faisal, and Herod, they've got a really interesting decision to make because they're outgunned.
Yeah.
It's just really that simple. So they have to figure out what to do. So what they decide is that they're going to send Hyrcanus and Faisal to negotiate with the Parthians and see, what kind of arrangements can we make, right? But they also agree that Herod is going to stay in reserve just in case this whole thing doesn't work out quite the way they anticipate.
This already sounds dicey for Hyrcanus and Faisal and shrewd on Herod's behalf.
Yeah, I mean, this is that typical, political scenario where it's like you're terrified on one hand, but you really don't have a whole lot of options on the other hand. You have to do something or, the enemy's just going to come and run you over.
So how did it go?
Well, you can imagine what probably happened. Faisal and Herod go to meet with the Parthians, but remember, they're there on Antigonus's behalf. So he's there too, representing his own interests, and he wants to be king or get his father reinstalled as king. So the first thing he does is, the story is unclear. The legends aren't exactly clear exactly what it was he does. He either cut off Hyrcanus's ears, or the legend says he bit them off. But the point being is that he disfigures him, so Hyrcanus can no longer be the high priest because the high priest cannot have a physical blemish like that and continue to be a high priest. And then in addition to it, Faisal gets killed. Again, it's unclear whether he was murdered or whether he committed suicide, was put in a position where he just knew he was going to die and decided to kill himself. But Hyrcanus and Faisal, just like we said, they ran into real trouble negotiating with Antigonus and the Parthians, and now that leaves Herod.
It's Herod's move.
It's Herod's move. He's back in Jerusalem, kind of like they had planned, trying to figure out what to do.
Does he have many options? What does he do?
No, he has really very few options because he can either stand and fight, which means he's probably going to lose, or he can engage in a strategic retreat and maybe live to fight another day.
I would guess that's exactly what he does.
And that is, of course, exactly what he does. So Herod was a master builder, and he had built several fortresses. One of his most famous is called Masada. It's on the west side of the Dead Sea. So he takes his family and a small army, and he leaves them at Masada because Masada is easily defensible, not a problem there. And then he takes off for Alexandria, Egypt, because he knows that's where he's going to find the Roman general Mark Antony, because he's hanging out with Cleopatra these days. But the funny part is he gets to Alexandria and Mark Antony isn't there.
So Herod throws his Hail Mary by going to Alexandria. But Mark Antony's not there.
Yeah, that's right.
So what's going to happen?
Well, pretty realistic expectation on his part. He hoped to find him there because that's where Mark Antony was hanging out those days, but he's not. So Cleopatra puts him on a ship for Rome because Mark Antony's back in Rome. So Herod sails to Rome and he meets with Mark Antony.
So he's received well in Rome.
Oh yeah, he was received very well because Mark Antony then takes him to meet Octavian, who is Julius Caesar's nephew, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, what Mark Antony does is he reminds Octavian that it was Herod's father, Antipater, who came to Julius Caesar's rescue in Egypt. So Octavian instantly befriends Herod. He doesn't like him very much, even at the early stage, let alone later. I mean, Octavian has some pretty amazing quotations about Herod. He did not like him very much, but they realized very quickly that Herod, once again, young, ambitious, military leader, politician, he is the perfect candidate to be the client king of Judea. So Mark Antony take him to the Roman Senate and present him as a candidate to be the king of Judea. And he is confirmed by the Roman Senate.
Okay. But Parthia is in control of Judea. So how is this going to work? I mean, having kingship bestowed by the Romans, how is that legitimate?
Well, that's that typical, political scenario, right? Because they don't literally control Judea, but they want to, and they did just 6 months ago. So what are they going to do? Well, they appoint Herod to be the client king of Judea. They give him this power, but then they say, okay, we need you to go take it back. And Herod...
And Rome is going to be the muscle?
That's right. That's exactly what's going to happen. Now, Herod has his own private army back in Judea, because that's how it worked back then. When you were nobility or royalty, you raised your own army. So Herod has his own army waiting for him. And once again, similar to Antipater in Egypt, this is a combined force of Judean fighters, Idumean fighters, Nabateans, and it's going to be, the term we would use today is it's going to be both regulars and guerrillas waiting for him back there. But Rome gives him 11 Roman legions to retake Judea from the Parthians.
Well, that's a formidable force, and he's successful, right? Because
Yes,
he becomes King Herod at some point.
Yeah, we know we know he becomes king, so we have to, we can already guess what the outcome is, but it takes him 3 years. He goes back and reinvades Judea, and then bit by bit, he manages to reconquer all of that territory. So by 37 BC, they rout the Parthians, they leave and they go home. He is the legitimate king of Judea by 37 BC.
And he is a successful king by all accounts. I mean, he's a master builder, and his reign is quite long.
Exactly. Well, do the math. So that's 37 BC, right? We know from doing our previous work that he dies in 1 BC.
Right.
So that's 36 years
That's
that
a good
he's
run.
on the throne. That's a really good run. As you've mentioned several times, he was a master builder. So despite the fact that he was clearly a tyrant, I mean, he epitomized being a tyrant,
Right.
he actually improved the country dramatically with his building projects. One of his major building projects was the restored temple. He built a port at Caesarea to increase trade. Judea didn't have a major port, so he built one.
So he was a master of infrastructure, a great politician, a ruthless man. All of this makes him a powerful leader.
Yeah, so he reconquers Judah, and he spends the next 36 years, here we go, defending his throne from any challenger. Because another kind of hidden component of this story is that he married Judean royalty. Now Herod, I forgot to mention, he's an Idumean like his father Antipater. He doesn't have an ounce of Jewish blood. He can actually never be a legitimate Judean king. He's only ever going to be a pretender to the throne.
That would make you very paranoid.
Exactly. So he marries Judean royalty, which in a way enhances his claim, but his wives and his children actually have a better claim to the throne than he does. So he spends the next 36 years defending his throne against all challengers, which includes members of his own family.
And we know how that goes. We know that he murders several members of his own family. I guess now that we have this better understanding of who Herod is, the question, though, is how does this connect back to our primary story, which is the birth of Christ?
Of course. Well, remember a little sub-theme that we're working with here, which is we started with, the United Kingdom under Saul and David and Solomon, and the fact that in the back of every Judean's mind, they've always wanted to see this restoration. And then when the Hasmoneans came into the picture, they thought they had it, right? But then the Romans come into the picture, and now they've got this pretender on the throne that they can't stand. So once again, this expectation
and the anticipation.
That's right, the expectation of a true king, of a ruler who is going to come by and he's going to get rid of Herod, he's going to push out the Romans. This is reaching, I wouldn't call it a fever pitch, but it is back in the forefront of everybody's mind. This is what they are thinking. And this is why we entitled this God Save the King, is because remember, Herod has likely got yes men around the throne saying, "Oh, great king, live forever, don't cut my head off, God save the king." But in reality, we're looking forward to the birth of the Mashiach Nagid, the Messiah, the King, a legitimate heir from the kingdom of David who's going to take the throne, which is why we're saying, God save the King.